Welcome back, guys. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Today I'm going to be talking about the top 5 improvements that I would like to see from Resident Evil 7 Biohazard to Resident Evil 8 Village. Before we begin, I just want to say this really quickly. If you enjoy this type of content and would love to see more, I would highly recommend you press the subscribe button, press the notification bell, that way you will always know when I post the next video. Also, I would greatly appreciate it if you drop me one of these bad boys down below, and you can also feel free to share these on social media platforms. That would help me out immensely for the YouTube algorithm. Let's begin. Starting with number 1, enemy and weapon variety. Although thematically speaking it made a lot of sense to make Resident Evil 7 Biohazard limited with its weapon arsenal to give it more of that grounded survival horror feeling, it could have benefited greatly from a larger roster of enemies. And because of this, the game started to feel like it was wearing out its welcome, especially by the last third. Thankfully, Capcom seems to have been listening. Judging from what little we've seen in the trailers, Resident Evil Village already seems to have remedied this problem, to a certain degree. For starters, the merchant makes a return, which probably means there's a lot more weapons to buy and collect. In addition to that, there's also weapon upgrades. There seems to be no molded this time. Instead, the standard enemies seem to be zombies once again, or a zombie/vampire hybrid, because those teeth do not look like any zombie's teeth I've ever seen. And on top of all this, there's probably even more bosses to fight this time around, and last but not least, maybe something to unlock after finishing the story. Number 2. A longer game. While Resident Evil 7 Biohazard did feel like it was wearing out its welcome by the end, it was not because of the story, but due to the lack of enemy and weapon variety. To be totally honest with you, I wish the story was a bit longer. I'm probably in the minority here, but I actually did like Ethan Winters a lot. I really wanted to see where his story goes. In my opinion, he's an underrated character. The general consensus is that Ethan doesn't have much of a personality. While I do agree with this to some extent, you must keep in mind that due to the limitations of the first-person perspective, Ethan is limited to expressing himself using only his hands and his voice. It is a lot more difficult to make a character memorable and relatable when you don't have a face to associate that character with, which is quite a shame actually. For a first-person character, he's actually very expressive. Not to mention, this is actually a matter of nostalgia. If you actually compare Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil 7, if you put aside the rose-tinted glasses for a while, and actually removing the barrier that sits between the third-person perspective and the first-person perspective, you can see that in reality, Ethan Winters actually behaves like a much more convincing person with just his hands and his voice than Jill and Chris ever do with their whole bodies. Except for just one scene in Resident Evil Remake, and that is the opening FMV, when Jill stumbles upon a pack of dogs feasting upon the lifeless corpse of Joseph Frost. While it is very brief, the moment she runs out of bullets and she still keeps clicking the gun, completely frozen and in utter disbelief, is a shining example of just how easy it is to win your audience over with just a couple of nuanced facial expressions. Ethan, on the other hand, did not have this luxury in Resident Evil 7, and yet still manages to carry the whole game on his shoulders, and this is all thanks to some stellar voice work, which has come a long way, even from Resident Evil Remake, which that in itself is already a night and day difference from the original Resident Evil game. I am actually surprised that Ethan is getting another game. He's actually the first main character to get a main title sequel right after his first outing. Deep down, I hope that this game is longer than Resident Evil 7, but even if it's not that much longer, I'm still happy that we got more Ethan Winters. Number 3. The ability to skip cutscenes. I'm not entirely certain why you couldn't skip cutscenes in Resident Evil 7. Most probably, it is because of the in-game cutscenes from the first-person perspective, which means there was no actual distinction between the cutscene and the game itself, so you couldn't actually skip it. I'm actually tired of this gimmick of seamless cutscenes. Some of these cutscenes just get old the minute you watch them, and given how Resident Evil is supposed to be a speedrun friendly franchise, I don't think it works in its favor to have cutscenes that cannot be skipped. In fact, it is because of this reason that despite the fact that I love Resident Evil 7, I find it very difficult to go back to and replay over and over. Which brings me to number 4, replay value. If it wasn't for such a sheer volume of downloadable content for Resident Evil 7, this game would have been way too short. That's not to say that the campaign itself is short, but the amount of replay value that it offers. You do have some options though. You can finish Madhouse mode, do some speedruns as well to unlock some items, but besides that, there's no extra game modes like there used to be. Even the infamous Mercenaries mode has been cut out in every single game ever since Resident Evil 7 came out. There probably still won't be a Mercenaries mode in Resident Evil Village, But what I am hoping for is that in the game itself, there will be a lot more going on, a lot more incentive to go out and get things done. Things that don't necessarily have to do with the story and would require you to go off the beaten path. All of this would not only just increase replay value, but will also have a huge impact on the last thing on this list. Number 5. A greater sense of scale. When talking about a great sense of scale in Resident Evil, which is the first game that comes to your mind? Is it Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 4, or Resident Evil Remake? Is it Resident Evil 5 with its linear set pieces, or Resident Evil 6 with its Michael Bay explosions? When I think of a Resident Evil game with a large sense of scale, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a big world. What it means though, that it is a very complicated maze that makes it feel bigger than it actually is. The first ones that always come to mind are Rockford Island from Code Veronica and the police station from Resident Evil 2 Remake. On the other hand, there's also Resident Evil 4. While Resident Evil 4 is very linear in nature, it still gave the illusion that you were wandering through big locations. Whether you were treading carefully through a creepy-ass village, or going through a castle, or even making your way through a military island, the world just felt massive. At some points in the game, you could even see locations from far away, which amplifies the illusion of scale even further. But, in my opinion, the ultimate, undisputed champion of scale of any Resident Evil game is the gigantic mansion from Resident Evil Remake. The mansion in Resident Evil just feels like a paradox. It is so claustrophobic and yet it feels so enormous. It is just so damn easy to get lost in this place. There is no way in hell that you are gonna remember where every room in this mansion is, and it's not even as huge as the castle in Resident Evil 4. But the elaborate complexity of this mansion just proves that you can take a small, decently sized building and make it into a humongous labyrinth. Resident Evil Remake is the best example in the franchise in terms of scale of what the general setting of any Resident Evil should be. But the Resident Evil franchise shouldn't just stick with reaching those heights, it should also evolve. This last console generation has sparked an incredible change of direction and level design. Most of the games now are becoming open world. Now hold your horses, I'm not saying Resident Evil should go fully open world, but we have seen something in survival horror games that has worked incredibly well in the last 5 years, and that is a semi-open world. The best implementation of this that I've seen so far is from The Evil Within 2. In Chapter 3, when you could go around freely in the city, allowing you to visit several buildings that aren't part of the main story. Exploration of these locations usually led to some kind of reward, whether it was currency for upgrades or weapons. However, unfortunately, this only happened once in the game and the rest of it was linear, which is too bad because this was clearly the most fun part of the entire game. Resident Evil 3 Remake from last year had an incredible opportunity to implement this feature for Raccoon City. Just think of how much of an improvement and how incredible it would have been if Raccoon City was a fully explorable semi-open world game. These last few years we've seen a lot of incredible horror titles that have benefited greatly from a semi-open world, including the very horror game that Resident Evil Village is clearly inspired by, and that title is none other than the critically acclaimed Bloodborne. Now, I've already mentioned Bloodborne on this channel, specifically the previous video. Now, while Bloodborne doesn't specifically have the interconnected world of Dark Souls 1, it does have a small hub which leads to a bunch of interconnected Metroidvania-style levels, full of shortcuts and secret pathways that lead back to old locations, much like the original Resident Evil games, and the most recent mainline entry, Resident Evil 7. It is just so unbelievably baffling to me that Capcom never looked at other horror games with open worlds or semi-open worlds and decided, we could use that. It's just such a no-brainer, this belongs in a Resident Evil game. It's gonna happen sooner or later. And I'm just hoping that it is sooner rather than later. And I'm hoping that it happens with Resident Evil Village. The blueprint is already there. You have the large geographical setting of Resident Evil 4 mixed with the Metroidvania style of classic Resident Evil games in 7. It is only a matter of time until Capcom realizes that the best way forward is to merge the two ideas together. And judging from the way Village resembles Bloodborne so closely, it is not a stretch to say that they're actually looking into this, and I'm hoping Resident Evil Village actually accomplishes this. It has been a long time coming. It's not a matter of whether if Capcom does this, but when. So that concludes the video about the top 5 improvements that Resident Evil Village has to make from Resident Evil 7 Biohazard and the remakes. If you did make it to the end of this video, I would like to take a moment and thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would love to see more of this content, be sure to press subscribe and press the notification bell. That helps me out a ton, and you will know when I post the next video. I would like to end this video with this. Are you excited for Resident Evil Village? And if so, what is it you're excited about the most? I would love to hear your feedback on this video. Do you agree with any of these? Is there any improvements that you would like to see that I haven't listed? Be sure to let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for tuning in to Rayven Draws, the channel where I do reviews, discussions, and also drawings of video games and movies that I like to talk about. Once again guys, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.